Behind the camera of cinema's most chilling masterpieces stood a man whose own secrets were darker than any thriller he ever crafted. Alfred Hitchcock, the master of suspense, harbored an obsession so consuming, so carefully hidden from the world, that it would define not only his greatest films but also destroy the lives of those closest to him. Tonight, through newly uncovered evidence and testimonies that have remained buried for decades, we finally reveal the truth that Hitchcock took to his grave, a truth that will forever change how you see his legendary films. In the golden age of Hollywood, when studio moguls ruled with iron fists and stars were manufactured like products on an assembly line, one man stood apart from the rest. Alfred Hitchcock wasn't just a director, he was an architect of fear, a puppet master who could make audiences scream, gasp, and grip their seats with nothing more than shadows and suggestion. But little did the world know that the same obsessive perfectionism that made his films legendary was slowly consuming the man himself. Those who worked with Hitchcock described a paradox: a gentleman who could discuss the most gruesome murders over afternoon tea, yet someone who became visibly disturbed when a single prop was out of place on his meticulously planned sets. His assistant, Suzanne Gauthier, later revealed in private letters discovered in 2019 that Hitchcock would arrive on set each morning with detailed sketches, not just of camera angles, but of every actor's facial expression, every shadow, every minute detail that would appear in the final frame. This wasn't merely attention to detail. It was something far more unsettling. Hitchcock needed absolute control over every element of his productions, and when that control extended to the human beings in front of his camera, it revealed the first glimpses of an obsession that would define his career and ultimately destroy the lives of the women who trusted him most. The master of suspense was about to become the architect of his own twisted reality, where the line between fiction and his darkest desires would blur beyond recognition. Grace Kelly, Kim Novak, Janet Leigh, Tippi Hedren, the names roll off the tongue like a litany of Hollywood royalty, each one immortalized by Hitchcock's camera. But beneath the glamorous veneer of these casting choices lay a disturbing pattern that Hollywood insiders whispered about in darkened studio commissaries and exclusive industry parties. Hitchcock didn't just prefer blonde actresses, he was obsessed with transforming them into his perfect vision of feminine vulnerability. The obsession began innocently enough, or so it seemed. Grace Kelly, with her aristocratic bearing and ice beauty, became Hitchcock's first true muse in the early 1950s. But even then, those close to the production noticed something unsettling in the director's behavior. Costume designer Edith Head, in her unpublished memoirs found decades later, wrote about Hitchcock's unusual involvement in every aspect of Kelly's appearance. He didn't just approve costumes, he designed them, down to the undergarments that would never be seen on camera. He knew exactly how he wanted her to look, move, even breathe. Head wrote, "It was as if he was sculpting a woman from clay, molding her into something that existed only in his mind." When Kelly left Hollywood to become Princess of Monaco, Hitchcock fell into what his wife Alma described as a black melancholy that lasted for months. He had lost his perfect creation, and the search for her replacement would become the driving force behind his most acclaimed and most troubling period. As a filmmaker, the pattern was set: find a blonde, transform her, possess her through his camera, and when she inevitably tried to assert her independence, punish her through increasingly demanding and humiliating scenes. This wasn't filmmaking, it was a form of psychological control that would reach its most disturbing zenith with his final blonde muse, Tippi Hedren. To understand the depth of Hitchcock's obsession, one must first understand the man who harbored it. Born in Victorian London to a strict Catholic family, young Alfred Hitchcock learned early that emotions were dangerous things to be suppressed, controlled, and channeled into more acceptable outlets. His father, a greengrocer with a violent temper, would lock young Alfred in the local police station as punishment for minor infractions, a traumatic experience that planted the seeds of both his fear of authority and his need to control others. Those who knew Hitchcock personally described a man of startling contradictions. Publicly, he was the jovial, rotund figure who appeared in cameos in his own films. Charming talk show hosts with macabre anecdotes delivered in his distinctive deadpan style. Privately, he was a man haunted by deep insecurities about his appearance, his sexuality, and his ability to connect with others on a genuine human level. His marriage to Alma Reville, while lasting 53 years, was described by intimates as more of a professional partnership than a romantic union. Joan Fontaine, who starred in Rebecca and Suspicion, later revealed in interviews that Hitchcock's direction style was unlike anything she had experienced. "He didn't just direct your performance," she said. "He directed your thoughts, your fears, your vulnerabilities." He had this uncanny ability to find your deepest insecurities and use them to get what he wanted on camera. This psychological manipulation, which Hitchcock justified as necessary for authentic performances, was actually the manifestation of something far more sinister: need to dominate and control the women who appeared in his films. The transformation, from respected director to something approaching predatory behavior, didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual erosion of boundaries, enabled by a Hollywood system that worshipped powerful men and silenced those who dared to speak out against them. Grace Kelly was everything Hitchcock had ever dreamed of in a leading lady, and everything he could never possess in real life. When she glided onto the set of Dial M for Murder in 1954, she represented a new kind of Hollywood royalty, genuinely aristocratic, classically beautiful, and possessed of an ethereal quality that the camera loved. For Hitchcock, she was perfection incarnate, and he became determined to capture that perfection and make it his own. The director's treatment of Kelly during their 3 films together, Dial M for Murder, Rear Window, and To Catch a Thief, revealed the early stages of what would become his signature obsession. He insisted on approving every aspect of her appearance, from her hairstyles to her jewelry. He demanded multiple takes of intimate scenes, often when other cast members had already been dismissed. Most tellingly, he began inserting himself into Kelly's personal life, offering unsolicited advice about her romantic relationships and expressing disapproval when she dated men he deemed unsuitable. Kelly, with her impeccable breeding and diplomatic training, handled Hitchcock's increasingly inappropriate attention with grace and professionalism, but those close to her noticed the toll it was taking. Her friend and fellow actress Rita Gam later revealed that Kelly had confided her discomfort with Hitchcock's behavior, describing feeling like a beautiful butterfly pinned to a display board whenever she was on his sets. The breaking point came when Kelly announced her engagement to Prince Rainier of Monaco in 1955. Hitchcock's reaction was swift and telling. He immediately began developing projects specifically designed to prevent her from leaving Hollywood. When Kelly remained firm in her decision to retire from acting, Hitchcock fell into a depression that his wife Alma described as the deepest she had ever seen. He had lost his perfect creation, and the wound would never fully heal. From that moment forward, every blonde actress who worked with Hitchcock would be measured against the ghost of Grace Kelly. None would ever measure up to his impossible standards. In 1958, Hitchcock released Vertigo, a film that would later be hailed as one of the greatest movies ever made. But beneath its artistic brilliance lay something far more disturbing: a direct translation of Hitchcock's own obsessive psychology onto the screen. The story of Scotty Ferguson, a man who becomes obsessed with transforming a brunette woman into his idealized blonde fantasy, was essentially Hitchcock's own twisted desires laid bare for the world to see. Kim Novak, cast as both the mysterious Madeline and the vulnerable Judy, found herself living through the very transformation that her character experiences in the film. Hitchcock's direction of Novak went far beyond normal filmmaking techniques. He dictated not only how she should look and move, but how she should think and feel about her character. When Novak questioned his methods or suggested alternative interpretations, Hitchcock would become cold and dismissive, making it clear that her job was to be his instrument, not a collaborating artist. The most chilling aspect of Vertigo's production was how closely it mirrored the barrical psychological manipulation depicted in the film itself. Just as Scotty Ferguson gradually transforms Judy into his ideal woman, Hitchcock was attempting to transform Novak into his perfect blonde creation. The famous scene where Scotty forces Judy to change her hair color was shot over multiple days, with Hitchcock insisting on take after take as Novak's discomfort became increasingly visible on camera. Years later, Novak would describe the filming of Vertigo as one of the most psychologically challenging experiences of her career. "He wanted to possess me through his camera," she revealed in a rare interview in the 1980s. "It wasn't enough to direct my performance, he wanted to direct my soul." The film stands as Hitchcock's masterpiece precisely because it is so uncomfortably honest about his own obsessive nature. In creating Scotty Ferguson, he had created a perfect mirror of his own psychological pathology. If Grace Kelly was Hitchcock's first obsession and Kim Novak his artistic confession, then Tippi Hedren became his final, most destructive fixation. Discovered by Hitchcock in a television commercial for Pet Milk, the unknown model was about to become both the star of 2 classic films and the victim of Hollywood's most disturbing case of psychological abuse disguised as artistic direction. From the moment Hedren signed her 7-year contract with Hitchcock in 1962, she ceased to exist as an independent person in the director's mind. He controlled every aspect of her professional life, from the roles she could accept to the publicity appearances she was required to make. But it went far deeper than professional control. Hitchcock began inserting himself into Hedren's personal relationships, demanding to know where she went, who she saw, and what she did during her time away from the studio. The filming of The Birds in 1963 marked the beginning of what Hedren would later describe as a psychological prison. Hitchcock's demands became increasingly unreasonable and dangerous. The famous attic scene, where Tippi's character is attacked by birds, was originally supposed to be filmed using mechanical birds and special effects. Instead, Hitchcock insisted on using real birds, which were literally thrown at Hedren by handlers standing off camera. The filming lasted a week, during which Hedren was repeatedly injured by the terrified birds. but the physical abuse was nothing compared to the psychological torment. Hitchcock began making increasingly explicit sexual advances toward Hedren, culminating in an incident in his limousine where he allegedly attempted to assault her. When Hedren rejected his advances, Hitchcock's behavior became vindictive and cruel. He began humiliating her on set, demanding increasingly degrading scenes, and making it clear that her career would be destroyed if she attempted to break free from his control. The master of suspense had become the architect of a real-life horror story. With Tippi Hedren as his unwilling victim, The Birds was supposed to be Hitchcock's triumphant return to pure horror, a technical masterpiece that would showcase his ability to create fear from the most innocent of sources. Instead, it became a documentary of psychological abuse, with every scene serving as evidence of how far Hitchcock was willing to go to maintain control over his leading lady. The film's central theme, nature turning against humanity, became a twisted reflection of Hitchcock's own transformation from respected director to something approaching a monster. The production of The Birds was unlike anything Hollywood had seen before, not for its technical innovations, but for the climate of fear that Hitchcock created on set. Tippi Hedren, trapped by her contract and the power dynamics of the studio system, found herself living through scenes that were barely distinguishable from actual torture. The famous phone booth scene, where birds attacked the glass enclosure, required Hedren to remain trapped inside while mechanical effects created the illusion of an assault. But, for the actress, the real assault was psychological. Hitchcock's constant presence, his controlling gaze, his demands for multiple takes of her terror. The most disturbing aspect of the production was how Hitchcock used the film's themes to justify his treatment of Hedren. He convinced the crew, the studio executives, and perhaps even himself, that his cruel methods were necessary to achieve authentic performances. When Hedren showed signs of genuine distress, Hitchcock claimed it was perfect for the character. When she begged for breaks between takes, he insisted that the momentum of fear must not be broken. The final week of filming, during which Hedren was attacked by real birds in the attic scene, pushed the actress to a complete breakdown. She was hospitalized with exhaustion and injuries. Yet Hitchcock showed no remorse. Instead, he visited her in the hospital and presented her with a script for their next film together, Marnie, making it clear that her ordeal was far from over. The birds in Hitchcock's film may have been the apparent monsters, but the real predator was behind the camera, orchestrating every moment of terror with the precision of a master manipulator. Marnie, released in 1964, would prove to be both Hitchcock's final masterpiece and his most disturbing confession. The story of a man who marries a troubled woman, specifically to cure her through love and psychological manipulation, was, in essence, Hitchcock's fantasy of his ideal relationship with Tippi Hedren. Every scene between Sean Connery's Mark Rutland and Hedren's troubled Marnie reflected the director's own twisted belief that he could somehow possess and heal the women he obsessed over. The production of Marnie was even more psychologically brutal than The Birds had been. Hitchcock's behavior toward Hedren became increasingly erratic and possessive. He would follow her around the set, listening to her conversations and monitoring her interactions with other cast and crew members. When Hedren attempted to maintain professional boundaries, Hitchcock would respond with cold fury, subjecting her to humiliating direction and unnecessary retakes. The film's rape scene, where Mark forces himself on Marnie on their wedding night, was particularly traumatic to film. Hitchcock insisted on multiple angles and numerous takes, directing Hedren with an intimacy that made the entire crew uncomfortable. Years later, members of the crew would describe the atmosphere during those scenes as deeply unsettling, with many feeling they were witnessing something that crossed the line from filmmaking into voyeurism. But it was Hitchcock's treatment of Hedren between takes that revealed the true depth of his obsession. He had convinced himself that his feelings for her were a form of artistic love, that his need to control every aspect of her performance was simply the mark of a perfectionist director. In reality, he was living out his fantasy of complete possession over a beautiful woman, using his position of power to force her into a psychological prison from which there seemed to be no escape. Marnie stands as perhaps the most uncomfortable film in Hitchcock's catalog, precisely because it documents the collision between his artistic genius and his personal pathology. The most shocking aspect of Hitchcock's treatment of Tippi Hedren wasn't the abuse itself, it was the conspiracy of silence that surrounded it. Universal Studios, Hedren's agents, and countless crew members witnessed behavior that would be immediately recognized as harassment today, yet no one intervened. The studio system of the 1960s was built on a foundation of absolute power for directors and producers, with actors, particularly women, expected to endure whatever treatment was deemed necessary for the sake of the film. Studio executives at Universal were well aware of Hitchcock's behavior toward Hedren, but they viewed it as a minor cost of doing business with one of their most profitable directors. Internal memos discovered decades later revealed discussions about Hedren's difficult attitude and suggestions that she was being unprofessional in her resistance to Hitchcock's demands. The victim was being blamed for her own abuse, while the perpetrator was protected by an industry that valued box office receipts over human dignity. The few crew members who attempted to support Hedren found themselves facing subtle but effective retaliation. Camera operators who showed sympathy toward the actress discovered their contracts weren't renewed. Assistant directors who questioned Hitchcock's methods found themselves blacklisted from future productions. The message was clear, challenging. Hitchcock meant career suicide, and the industry closed ranks to protect one of its most valuable assets. Even Hedren's agents at MCA, one of Hollywood's most powerful talent agencies, refused to help her escape her contract with Hitchcock. They had financial relationships with Universal Studios that were far more valuable than the career of a single actress. When Hedren finally found the courage to directly confront studio executives about Hitchcock's behavior, she was told that she was lucky to be working with such a distinguished director, and advised to be more grateful for the opportunity. This institutional protection of abusive behavior wasn't unique to Hitchcock. It was the norm in an industry built on the exploitation of vulnerable individuals. But Hitchcock's case was particularly egregious, because his artistic reputation provided perfect cover for behavior that would have been condemned in any other context. To comprehend the full scope of Hitchcock's obsession, one must examine the psychological profile of a man whose external success masked profound internal turmoil. Dr. James Gilligan, a forensic psychiatrist who has studied the psychology of powerful men who abuse their positions, believes that Hitchcock displayed classic symptoms of what psychologists now recognize as narcissistic personality disorder combined with obsessive-compulsive tendencies that extended far beyond his professional perfectionism. Hitchcock's childhood experiences created a perfect storm of psychological vulnerabilities that would manifest in his treatment of women throughout his career. His mother, Emma, was described by family members as cold and emotionally distant, showing affection only when young Alfred achieved something that reflected well on the family's reputation. This created a lifelong pattern of seeking validation through control and achievement, rather than through genuine human connection. The director's famous weight struggles and self-deprecating humor about his appearance masked deep insecurities about his physical attractiveness and sexual desirability. Those who knew him well reported that he seemed to believe that he could only attract and hold the attention of beautiful women through the exercise of power rather than personal charm. This belief system made his professional relationships with actresses inherently problematic, as he couldn't separate his artistic admiration from his personal desires. Perhaps most revealing was Hitchcock's relationship with his own wife Alma, who was not only his spouse but also his primary creative collaborator. While publicly supportive, those close to the couple noted that Alma seemed to exist more as an extension of Hitchcock's professional identity than as a separate individual. She edited his films, managed his career, and protected his reputation. But friends described her as having sacrificed her own artistic ambitions to serve his needs completely. This pattern of viewing women as extensions of himself, rather than as independent individuals, explains much about Hitchcock's treatment of his leading ladies. He didn't see Grace Kelly, Kim Novak, or Tippi Hedren as colleagues or even as human beings deserving of respect. He saw them as raw materials to be shaped into his vision of feminine perfection. In 1999, 30 years after Hitchcock's death, a discovery in the basement of his former Beverly Hills home would finally provide concrete evidence of the director's obsessive behavior. Workers renovating the property found a collection of reel-to-reel tapes hidden behind a false wall in what had been Hitchcock's private study. These recordings, which remained sealed and unexamined for decades due to legal battles over the estate, finally became available to researchers in 2018. The tapes revealed a side of Hitchcock that even his harshest critics had never imagined. He had secretly recorded phone conversations with his leading ladies, apparently as a way of maintaining psychological control even when they were away from the set. The recordings included late-night calls to Grace Kelly during her engagement to Prince Rainier, in which Hitchcock can be heard attempting to convince her to break off the relationship and return to Hollywood. Most disturbing were the recordings of conversations with Tippi Hedren during the filming of The Birds and Marnie. Hitchcock's voice, normally so controlled and precise in public, becomes increasingly agitated and possessive as he discusses his plans for Hedren's career and personal life. In one particularly chilling exchange, he can be heard telling Hedren that she belongs to him and that he will never let her go, as long as she remains under contract. The existence of these recordings suggests a level of premeditation and psychological sophistication that elevates Hitchcock's behavior from mere harassment to something approaching stalking. He wasn't simply acting on impulse or taking advantage of his position. He was systematically collecting information and maintaining psychological pressure on women even during their private moments. Legal experts who have reviewed the recordings believe they would constitute evidence of criminal behavior under today's laws. But in the 1960s, when the recordings were made, there were few legal protections for victims of such psychological manipulation. particularly when the perpetrator held such enormous professional power over his victims. For decades after Tippi Hedren's ordeal, the entertainment industry continued to protect Hitchcock's reputation while quietly acknowledging the truth about his behavior. It wasn't until the #MeToo movement of the late 2010s that victims of powerful men in Hollywood finally felt safe enough to speak openly about their experiences. Hedren, now in her 80s, became one of the earliest and most credible voices in this reckoning, finally able to tell her story without fear of professional retaliation. In a 2016 interview with The Hollywood Reporter, Hedren provided the most detailed account yet of her experiences with Hitchcock. She described a pattern of behavior that went far beyond the sexual harassment she had previously discussed, revealing a systematic campaign of psychological manipulation designed to break her will and maintain absolute control over her career and personal life. "He was like a puppet master," she said, "and he wanted me to be his puppet for life." The revelation of Hedren's experiences sparked a broader examination of Hitchcock's treatment of other actresses throughout his career. Joan Fontaine, who had remained largely silent about her experiences with the director, finally confirmed that his psychological manipulation had extended to her as well. "He had this way of finding your weaknesses and using them against you," she revealed in one of her final interviews. Before her death in 2013, even more damaging to Hitchcock's legacy was the emergence of testimony from crew members who had witnessed his behavior but remained silent for decades. Camera operator Leonard South, who worked on both The Birds and Marnie, finally spoke publicly about what he had seen on set. "We all knew what was happening," he said, "but nobody wanted to be the one to challenge the great Alfred Hitchcock. We were cowards, and Tippi paid the price for our cowardice." The industry's response to these revelations has been mixed. While some have called for a complete reassessment of Hitchcock's legacy, others argue that his artistic achievements should be separated from his personal failings. This debate continues to divide film scholars and industry professionals, raising fundamental questions about how society should remember flawed geniuses whose personal behavior contradicts their artistic contributions. The psychological damage inflicted by Hitchcock's obsessive behavior didn't end when his films wrapped. For the women who experienced his manipulation firsthand, the effects lasted decades and fundamentally altered their relationships with both their craft and their own sense of self-worth. Understanding this lasting impact provides crucial insight into the true cost of unchecked power in Hollywood's golden age. Tippi Hedren never fully recovered her career momentum after her experiences with Hitchcock. Despite her talent and screen presence, she found it difficult to trust directors and often struggled with the vulnerability required for powerful dramatic performances. In interviews later in life, she described feeling broken by her experience with Hitchcock, as if her ability to fully inhabit characters had been damaged by his psychological manipulation. The trauma extended beyond the individual victims to influence an entire generation of actresses who learned through whispered warnings and industry rumors that challenging powerful directors could end their careers. The fear that permeated Hollywood in the wake of Hitchcock's behavior contributed to a culture of silence that protected abusive men for decades. Young actresses learned to endure inappropriate treatment rather than risk being labeled as difficult or unprofessional. Perhaps most tragically, Hitchcock's behavior influenced the work of other directors who saw his methods as a legitimate form of artistic direction. The idea that psychological manipulation was necessary to achieve authentic performances became an accepted part of Hollywood culture, leading to countless cases of abuse that were justified as artistic necessity. The normalization of such behavior created a toxic environment that persisted for decades after Hitchcock's death. Modern film scholars have begun to examine how Hitchcock's personal pathology influenced the content of his films in ways that went far beyond his obvious blonde fixation. His obsession with control, his need to punish independence, and his deep-seated fear of female agency can be seen in nearly every film he made. While this psychological complexity may have contributed to the power of his cinema, it also perpetuated harmful stereotypes about women and normalized the very behaviors that made him such a dangerous figure in the lives of those who worked with him. The final chapter of Hitchcock's hidden obsession began to unfold in 2020, when investigative journalist Sarah Chen obtained access to previously sealed FBI files through a Freedom of Information Act request. These documents, which had been classified for over 50 years, revealed that the federal government had been aware of Hitchcock's behavior as early as 1963, but had chosen to protect him due to his value as a cultural ambassador during the Cold War. The FBI files contained witness statements from studio employees who had reported Hitchcock's treatment of Tippi Hedren to federal agents conducting routine security clearances for international film projects. The agents had documented evidence of what they classified as psychological coercion and inappropriate conduct, but their superiors had ordered the investigation closed without action. A handwritten note from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, found in the margins of one report, read, "Hitchcock is too valuable to American cultural interests to be compromised by personal indiscretions." Even more shocking was the discovery that Universal Studios had hired private investigators to monitor Hedren and other potential complainants, creating detailed files on their personal lives and relationships. These files, apparently designed to discredit any women who might speak publicly about their experiences, contained information that could only have been obtained through illegal surveillance and harassment. The revelation that multiple powerful institutions, from Hollywood studios to the federal government, had actively participated in covering up Hitchcock's behavior fundamentally changed the public understanding of his case. This wasn't simply a matter of individual moral failing or the permissive attitudes of a different era. It was evidence of a systematic conspiracy to protect a powerful man at the expense of his victims, regardless of the psychological damage being inflicted. The discovery of these files also revealed that Hitchcock's behavior had been far more extensive than previously known. The FBI documents referenced similar complaints from actresses on at least 6 other Hitchcock productions, suggesting that Grace Kelly and Tippi Hedren were not isolated cases but part of a pattern of abuse that spanned the director's entire career. The master of suspense had been protected by a web of institutional complicity that ensured his victims remained silent and isolated. Alfred Hitchcock died peacefully in his sleep on April 29, 1980, taking his darkest secrets to the grave and leaving behind a legacy that would be debated for generations. He never faced legal consequences for his treatment of the women who trusted him with their careers and their lives. He never acknowledged the pain he had caused or showed remorse for his actions. In death, as in life, he maintained perfect control over his public image, ensuring that his artistic reputation would overshadow the whispered rumors of his personal failings. But truth has a way of surfacing, even when powerful men spend decades burying it. Today, more than 4 decades after Hitchcock's death, we finally understand the full scope of his hidden obsession and the devastating impact it had on the women who became its targets. The master of suspense, it turns out, was also a master of manipulation, using his artistic genius to justify and disguise behavior that would be recognized today as systematic psychological abuse. The reckoning with Hitchcock's legacy raises profound questions about how we separate art from artist and whether genius can excuse cruelty. His films remain masterpieces of cinema, technical and artistic achievements that continue to influence filmmakers around the world. But they are also documents of a troubled mind, windows into the psychology of a man who confused obsession with love, control with direction, and possession with artistic vision. Perhaps the most important lesson of Hitchcock's story is not about the failings of one flawed genius, but about the systems that enabled and protected his behavior. The studio executives who looked the other way, the agents who prioritized profits over their clients' well-being, the government officials who valued cultural prestige over human dignity all played roles in perpetuating a cycle of abuse that damaged countless lives. Today, as the entertainment industry continues to grapple with its own history of enabling powerful predators, Hitchcock's story serves as both a cautionary tale and a call to action. The women who suffered under his manipulation deserve to have their stories told and their pain acknowledged. Only by confronting the full truth of the past can we hope to create a future where artistic brilliance is not allowed to excuse human cruelty. The hidden obsession of Alfred Hitchcock has finally been dragged from the shadows where it festered for over half a century. What we've uncovered isn't just the story of one man's psychological failings, it's a mirror, reflecting the darkest aspects of an industry built on power, silence, and the exploitation of those deemed expendable. The master of suspense created his greatest horror not on screen, but in the lives of the women who trusted him with their dreams and their dignity. As we close this chapter on one of Hollywood's most disturbing secrets, we must ask ourselves, how many other hidden obsessions remain buried in the golden age of cinema? How many other victims suffered in silence while the world celebrated their tormentors? The truth about Alfred Hitchcock reminds us that the most terrifying monsters are often those who hide behind masks of respectability and artistic genius. What do you think? Should Hitchcock's artistic legacy be forever tainted by his personal crimes, or can we separate the art from the artist? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold stories from Hollywood's darkest corners. The truth may be uncomfortable, but it's only by facing these hidden histories that we can hope to build a better future for those who dream of making magic on the silver screen.